Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to participate in this very interesting and very inspiring conference. My lecture will touch quite a lot of the points which were just discussed in this very lively and critical way. And so maybe we will continue discussion after my lecture. To make it easier, I would like to present my structure to make it easier for you to follow my lecture. Our topic starts with a question: the rule of what? And as a former state secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Justice and currently attorney at law, there's just one possible answer: of course, the rule of law. Today, the rule of law is taken for granted in Germany and the other member states of the EU. It's an integral part of our constitution and the European treaties. But as especially you in Belarus very well know, we had different times in our history when under the Nazi regime pure despotism governed, the federal structure of our state, the division of powers were abolished, courts' appointment of judges and the education of lawyers were centralized and under direct state control. All relevant interest groups, trade unions, employers' associations, all professional associations, they all were under total state control. And in the economic sector, the system was marked by a comprehensive system of price control and management regulation. After losing the war in 1945, just a very brief history, most of the Germans desperately wanted freedom, democracy, and an economy free of state intervention and domination that serves the welfare and needs of the entire population. And that was the beginning of the very successful so-called social market economy. And social market economy means not just an economic model, but an economic and social order based on the rule of law. It combines free individual initiative and social welfare on the basis of a competitive economy within a strong legal framework. This new order was the main reason for the so-called German miracle after World War II and our political and economic success during the last 60 years. And today it helps us to meet the challenges of globalization and the digital revolution. And social market economy is a German export hit. As you presented me, I've been in quite a lot of transformation countries in the context of legal cooperation, and everywhere people were interested in two aspects. First, our legal system, the German legal system based on the rule of law, which guarantees legal certainty for our citizens and our companies, but also for foreign investors, and is the best protection against corruption. And the second interest of my dialogue partners always referred to the reasons of the success for our economic system. And one main reason for this economic success, you won't be surprised, is the rule of law. The rule of law as a driver of economic growth. The basis for free markets and free competition in Germany is our constitution. It guarantees human dignity and personal freedom, including the freedom to start a business, the freedom of contract and formation of prices, the freedom of assembly and the right to form associations to safeguard and improve working and economic conditions. Our constitution also guarantees private property and inheritance, and it explicitly guarantees the rule of law. I suppose most of you are lawyers, so I will read Article 20. It reads as follows. Article 20 of our basic law: the legislature shall be bound by constitutional order, the executive and the judiciary by law and justice. And another important principle, you just discussed that aspect, another important principle of our constitution states that essential issues have to be regulated by law and not just by decree. Modern legislation and legal certainty. Economic growth needs the right constitutional and legal framework. It needs legal certainty and a modern and flexible legislation, especially in the field of business, economic, commercial, and civil law. You also discussed this before. Law which frees up space for businesses to be innovative and successful in the market. In addition, the legal framework in a social market economy has to safeguard open markets and the control of market power without interfering in the market's self-control, and this is done by an efficient antitrust law. The legislative process. To safeguard such a modern and flexible legislation, you have to strengthen the legislative capacity, public participation, and the transparency of the lawmaking process. This you just discussed also. It was very interesting to follow. Participation and transparency in the field of legislation are important drivers of economic growth. Why that? In Germany, all relevant stakeholders and interest groups, and we have thousands of them, are invited to present their interests at all stages of the legislation process. That safeguards that our laws meet the practical needs of citizens and companies and is not reduced to the proposals of the administration. There you're sitting at the green table. I worked in the ministry for 20 years and I know exactly. We are sitting at the green table. We need the expertise from the practitioners. And so public participation from the start increases the acceptance of the law and the legal awareness of all stakeholders. A fair and public debate during the whole lawmaking process is a precondition to finally find a fair balance of interests. And legislation is a never-ending process, and you can always make it better. Under the heading Better Legislation, the German discussion concentrates on more clarity of our laws, time limits, obligatory evaluation clauses, and the reduction of costs and bureaucracy caused by new laws. For several years, we follow the principle of one in, one out. That means for every new law, the legislator must repeal an existing one. And we discuss now about one in, two out. Information and transparency in the field of legislation. There is no participation and transparency without information. To safeguard an open discussion during the legislative process, all proposals, draft laws, and the referring position papers of the relevant interest groups are published and accessible for everyone. And a database which includes the whole German legislation, called Laws on the Internet, enables every citizen to inform him or herself about the legislation he or she is interested in. The impact of an independent and effective judiciary for economic growth. You also discussed this before. Better legislation, participation, and transparency of the lawmaking process are not enough. A state and economy governed by the rule of law also need an independent, competent, and effective judiciary in which citizens and businesses can trust. Courts as drivers of legislative reforms. Courts in Germany not only implement the law, they also play an important role as drivers of legislative reforms in all legal fields by developing the law through court decisions. There are relevant legal fields like the labor law, which are dominated and defined by our courts. For example, the legal conditions for union strikes are not defined by law, but by several decisions of our Federal Labor Court. Of course, the Parliament, as the legislator, could regulate the field, but it doesn't, because the labor courts act on the basis of our Constitution and are much more flexible than the legislator could ever be. And this is exactly what the economy needs in these cases, because a strike, of course, is expensive, and employers and employees are interested in legal certainty and quick solutions at the same time. Competition law is another field. The text of the relevant German law is quite short, and on the basis of numerous decisions of our Federal High Court, the civil courts define what kind of behavior in the market is legally acceptable. Our courts safeguard legal certainty, flexibility, and efficient proceedings, and are thus drivers of economic growth. From time to time, our judges also call for the legislator to reform a certain legal provision. Usually they do this by hints in their court decisions, although these decisions, of course, just apply to the concrete case. And just a few weeks ago, the Association of Judges proposed a reform of our procedural law to speed up the court proceedings. After all, good law is also fast law. This is why the image of our judiciary in the German society is not that of a repressive system that is reduced to criminal proceedings. Our courts and judges are important, active, and accepted players in the legislative process. Independent judges as a cornerstone, education and selection of the best. For this important and responsible role in our society, you need well-educated, well-paid, and most important, really independent judges. In our history, we learned that it needs a lot of different institutional safeguards and conditions to guarantee an independent judiciary in which citizens and businesses can trust. We do have such safeguards for the so-called third power on the constitutional level, like the principle of rule of law, fair trial, the division of powers, the federal structure of our state and court system, detailed provision in our Constitution concerning the independence and election of judges. And these constitutional provisions are completed by detailed laws on the position, election rights, and salaries of judges. They got to present first-class degrees and are elected by special independent commissions, not by the Minister of Justice, and they are appointed for lifetime. They have a guaranteed and reasonable salary, and thus they are resistant to corruption and are very respected persons in our society with a high ethical standard. And one important reason for this influential position is the education of our lawyers and its organization. This is my last point. You can study law in numerous universities all over Germany, public and private ones. They compete with each other to get the best students. The universities are financed by the taxpayer, but they are totally independent concerning the form and substance of the lectures. Our professors are independent as well. And law students have a free choice where they want to study. And this guarantees that there is no ideological or political indoctrination of young lawyers. The two state exams, the first with a scientific emphasis and the second with a practical emphasis, are quite challenging and time-consuming, and thus we safeguard the selection of the best. Every year, 30% of the students don't pass the exam. We live in a globalized world. Basics like civil, penal, and public law are obligatory, but economic and international law, often taught in English, is becoming more and more important. Quite often, young lawyers choose the way I chose. They start to work in a law firm or in a company, and then they change to administration. They are prepared to deal even with complex business cases in a reasonable time. Some of them, of course, always also change to be a judge. And coming back to our courts and business, our civil courts dealing with commercial law are composed of one professional and two practitioners. Maybe this could be a good example for your country as well. And other court divisions are specialized in particular fields of law like building law, industrial property law, company law, and others. And this also safeguards practice-orientated and quick court decision in business cases. And this is the right framework for economic growth. Information and transparency in the field of justice. Like in the field of legislation, information and transparency in the field of justice is a must. In Germany, you can find all relevant court decisions on the internet, and more courts establish a communication unit headed by a judge who communicates and explains important court cases. That makes it also easier for our media to report on judicial matters. Outlook. I know very well that Belarus is currently moving forward in strengthening the legislative capacity and the judiciary as important factors of economic growth. I'm co-chair in a very ambitious joint project of the UN, the EU, and the German government, represented by a foundation, the German Foundation on International Legal Cooperation, a joint project together with the Belarusian government relating to better legislation and access to justice. In the light of what I said about the rule of law as a driver of economic growth, I'm very confident that reforms in these fields will definitely help your economy to grow, and I invite every lawyer in this country, and especially the Bar Association, to be interested in this project and to be a dialogue partner in this project, because I think after the discussion I followed just before, this is a very critical field. But I think there is a lot of hope, because yesterday I had the chance to give a lecture at the Belarusian State University, the law faculty, and there I met quite a lot of young, very interested, very engaged, very open-minded young lawyers, and this is the foundation you need for the reforms coming along, and we talked about foundations this morning. I think you have a good foundation if you look at your law students. So thank you very much.